Could you please help this new channel by liking and subscribing? As you see, most of you listening are not subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. Thank you so much. After months of grinding at work with zero vacation time, I finally decided to treat myself to a much-needed getaway. I found this cozy little cottage on Airbnb tucked away in the countryside outside the city. It looked like the perfect quiet escape from the daily grind based on the listing. Rustic charm, surrounded by nature, with great reviews from previous guests about how peaceful and relaxing the property was. I quickly booked it for a long weekend before someone else could snatch up those dates. From the moment I pulled into the long, winding driveway lined by tall pines, the cottage looked even more idyllic than the listing photos portrayed. Just how I pictured spending a few tranquil days away from the hustle, unplugging completely, sleeping in, curling up by the fireplace with a good book, and taking long hikes while reconnecting with nature. The adorable two-story A-frame structure looked practically picture-perfect, like a schmaltzy postcard advertising Vermont tourism. Those first couple days truly were an amazing mental reset. I hiked for miles in the nearby forests and slept better than I had in months, lulled by the crickets and hooting owls outside the open windows. For the first time in forever, I felt like my usual stress disappeared as I became completely immersed in the slower rhythm of life on the property. But that all changed during my final night. I was awoken around 3 a.m. by rhythmic thuds that sounded almost like someone emphatically knocking on the front door of the cottage. At first, I just tried to ignore it, scrunching my eyes shut tighter and telling myself it was probably just a loose tree branch slamming against part of the roof, given the area's infamous high winds. But the knocking persisted, gradually becoming louder and more insistent. My heart began pounding as I strained to detect any other noises from downstairs that would confirm whether it was just the natural ambience playing tricks, or if someone was actually there. Scrambling to my feet, I crept to the bedroom window overlooking the driveway. Sure enough, there wasn't any moonlight glinting off a car that could explain the noise away as a late arriving guest. Just the swaying shadows of the trees surrounding the inky black abyss leading up to the house. The sense that something wasn't right grew deeper in my gut. Part of me knew I should just call the property owner or even the police to report suspicious noises, but I was paralyzed by fear in the moment. I eventually mustered enough courage to creep downstairs, clutching the heaviest object I could grab as a makeshift weapon just in case. But by the time I reached the front door, the knocking had stopped. I pressed my ear against the thick oak, but heard nothing except my own pulse pounding away in terror. Given no further noises and the darkness masking any potential threats lurking outside, I finally coaxed myself back upstairs, trying to rationalize it was kids from a nearby farm playing a prank. Yet I still barely slept a wink the rest of that final night, constantly jolting awake at every creak and rustle from the surrounding woods, which seemed amplified tenfold through the anxiety now coursing through my veins. The following morning, still unnerved, I scoured the cottage for any potential security cameras the owner may have set up around the exterior in case they captured footage of who or what had been lurking around in those eerie pre-dawn hours. I finally located a discreet camera positioned to survey the driveway area and eagerly review the recording from the previous night, desperate for some kind of explanation, though my mind at ease. Instead, the video file sent an icy chill down my spine, unlike anything I'd experienced before. Clear as day, it showed a lone figure shrouded in darkness standing completely motionless in the light spill just beyond the driveway's edge. They didn't so much as flinch for a haunting 6-hour span, literally just standing there and appearing to almost stare directly into the unblinking camera lens the entire time. My heart felt like it trapped itself in my throat as I watched the time stamps slowly progress past those witching hours when the knocking had sent me into a cold sweat of panic. Just how close had this ominous lurker potentially been from breaching the cottage while I lay there paralyzed, frozen in place under the covers like a coward? Was it just some harmless pranking youth after all, or something far more sinister merely biding their time to strike once I'd fallen back asleep? I immediately forwarded the highly suspicious footage to the property owners and hightailed it out of there. Sudden getaway be damned. In hindsight, I realized I potentially overreacted, and there could be a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. Or maybe none, and I dodged an absolute nightmare situation unfolding on that final night. Either way, I'm honestly terrified to ever find out specifics of what kind of deranged or dangerous individual could have been staking out those woods, and what their intentions may have been. That's a weekend getaway I'll never forget, unfortunately. I should have taken it as a red flag when the Airbnb listing described the apartment as cozy, realtor code for tiny shoebox. But I'd waited too long to book my summer visit to my sister's city, and affordable options were extremely limited by that point. Beggars can't be choosers, right? Besides, the place looked clean and nicely updated in the pics, and I'd only be crashing there at night after long days exploring the town. How bad could it be? In retrospect, famous last words. From the moment I stepped inside, hauling my overstuffed suitcase through the narrow entryway, an unsettling vibe began washing over me. Maybe it was just the cramped quarters playing tricks on my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the apartment. Almost like I was being watched or followed by some unseen presence as I toured the single bedroom, bathroom, and galley-sized kitchen/living room area. I tried brushing it off as travel paranoia, telling myself I just needed to acclimate to the temporary space. But that night, as I lay there tossing and turning, my skin began prickling with an anxious tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. Every creak and groan from the building's aged woodwork sent my heart racing irrationally. While each one likely had a simple, benign explanation, my imagination started weaving stories of unknown entities lurking just on the other side of the paper-thin walls. After finally drifting off into a restless slumber, I was ripped awake in a cold sweat around 3 a.m. by an unmistakable noise, the sound of footsteps slowly, methodically creaking across the rickety hardwood floor in the main room just outside the bedroom door. Despite being drenched in darkness, my blood instantly turned to ice in my veins. There was no mistaking that something, or someone, was out there mere feet away. I laid there completely paralyzed, straining my senses in the inky blackness but sensing no other sounds or movements for what felt like an eternity. Just as my pounding heart rate began descending from panic attack territory, that's when it happened. A dense, pitch-black shadow slowly oozed across the sliver of dim hallway light seeping through the cracked bedroom door. I wanted to scream but only managed a breathless gasp as the darkness engulfed every degree of visibility. Unsure if my mind was playing tricks from the eerie surroundings or if I'd now become institutionally insane, somehow I eventually drifted back into a prone, quasi-catatonic state until morning light finally broke through the curtains. With a deep breath, I unraveled the covers and stumbled into the main room. Every hair on my neck instantly stood on end. There, in the narrow span between the tiny kitchen and living area, 3 strange impressions on the hardwood bore the unmistakable outline of human-sized footprints in the thick dust outlining the perimeter of the furniture, like whatever entity had been skulking around in there while I laid awake, immobilized by terror. Over the next couple nights, the phenomena only got progressively more unsettling. Twice more, strange whispers and creaky shuffling sounds roused me from already disturbed slumbers, despite being barricaded alone inside with every window and door securely locked. One particularly terrifying morning, after a dead sprint of unconscious slumber devoid of any paranormal drama, I awoke to find the bedroom closet door inexplicably wide open, clothes and suitcase wildly strewn about as if some raging poltergeist had torn through and ransacked my belongings overnight. Although I repeatedly triple-checked that every potential entrance was still dead-bolted shut, it became impossible to shake the sense that some kind of ghostly, malicious presence had decided to make my temporary stay there as psychologically torturous as possible. Whether it was the spirit of a former, forgotten tenant or some older supernatural entity that stalked the property, I'll never know for sure. but it got to the point where I spent most of my remaining days there manically scouring the internet for any mentions of hauntings or dark histories involving the address to no avail. Suffice it to say, the second my scheduled checkout arrived, I fled that place like a bat out of hell first thing at sunrise without looking back. To this day, the hair still stands up on the back of my neck anytime an old apartment building creaks or settles, immediately transporting me back to those pitch-black dead-of-night hours spent lying in a cold sweat, paralyzed with primal fear of whatever malicious invisible force seemed to be lurking in those cramped spaces just on the other side of the door. This romantic getaway to Croatia with my girlfriend was supposed to be the dream vacation of a lifetime. We'd scrimped and saved for over a year to afford an authentic Mediterranean experience, staying in a cozy, centuries-old stone villa on the sparkling Adriatic coast, living like locals in one of those picturesque seaside villages you see splashed across tourism brochures. The Airbnb listing photos made the place look like an absolute fairy tale. And let me tell you, from the moment we arrived at the villa nestled along the harbor's edge, the real thing miraculously exceeded those glossy fantasy shots. Sunshine spilled across the charming flower boxes framing the arched front windows as we pulled up the cobblestone driveway, while salty ocean breezes carried the symphony of church bells chiming across the red clay rooftops. We couldn't stop grinning ear to ear and squeezing each other, scarcely believing this would be our temporary home for the next 10 days. Our host Marco was an overly gracious older man with an infectious smile, who welcomed us like long-lost relatives despite the language barrier. As he led us on the grand tour, I became enamored with the rustic interior preserving its old-world authenticity, from the original wooden ceiling beams to the decades-old furnishings reupholstered into a quirky, cozy decor. Every nook and cranny exuded a sense of permeable history and warmth you could never artificially recreate in a modern building. The first few sun-soaked days were an absolute dream, cycling from sweeping cliffside vistas to seaside vineyards and hidden pebble beaches. We'd return each evening eagerly swapping stories over fresh seafood and crisp local wine, making ourselves at home in that tiny slice of heaven. But as the casual bliss of vacation settled in, I began noticing little things. At first, I brushed them off as just endearing remnants of the villa's antiquated quirks, like the weird thumps and creaks that would randomly reverberate from other rooms even if no one was inside them, the faint electrical buzzing that sometimes filled the thick brick walls in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and most perplexing of all, those two innocuous vents located up high on the walls in the main living area and bathroom that never seemed to circulate any airflow no matter how I inspected them. My curiosities eventually grew into full-blown suspicions that maybe not everything inside that sun-dappled Mediterranean paradise was quite as warm and welcoming as it appeared on the surface. But it wasn't until later one night while grabbing another bottle of wine from the cellar that my blood instantly turned to ice water. I was rustling around in the cramped, dimly lit storage room, trying to find the way back when my foot struck something hard, causing a dull thud to reverberate through the floor. Instinctively, I got on my hands and knees and swept away the dirt, revealing a rudimentary trapdoor carved into the stone-tiled ground with a small latch at its center. Throwing caution to the wind, I tugged it open and a musty billow of stale air burst forth, carrying an unmistakable sense of history and secrets long suppressed. The trapdoor turned out to be the innocuous entrance to a hidden, pitch-black crawlspace, one shockingly large enough to be easily traversed by an average-sized human in a crouched stance. Now undeniably creeped out but utterly gripped by morbid curiosity, I returned with a flashlight and began gingerly navigating the dusty chamber. At first, everything seemed pretty benign. Dirt-packed floors, low wooden beam ceilings, standard dwelling foundations for a home of this age. But then the tunnel curved and my light beams caught the glint of something metallic glimmering deeper ahead and my heart skipped multiple beats. That's when I entered an entirely separate, even more unsettling antechamber, one lined wall to wall in wires, circuitry boards, audio equipment, and CCTV components that made my skin crawl. It was like something ripped straight from a Cold War-era spy movie, complete with miniature camera lenses discreetly embedded in the walls and overhead, all meticulously positioned to provide surreptitious surveillance across every private inch of the villa's main spaces, the bedrooms, bathrooms, even where we'd been eating and lounging like we had zero cause for concern. I'll never forget the sickening knot that twisted inside my stomach at that moment, catching glimpses of the upper villa's living area through those hidden lenses. Had we been obliviously putting on a live peep show for some voyeuristic creep that whole time? My mind raced trying to rationalize away what I was looking at. Maybe this wires-crossed spooky setup was just a bizarre holdover from the villa's former inhabitants that had somehow slipped through the cracks. No way the host would dare secretly record guests in such a brazen violation of every ethical standard imaginable, right? One thing's for certain, the rest of our romantic stay in that place was consumed by tossing and turning through sleepless nights racked with panicked thoughts. Had every intimate, private moment been clandestinely monitored and recorded the entire time without our knowledge? I eventually became so rattled and paranoid that we ended up cutting our trip short and immediately checking into a reputable hotel for the remainder of our time abroad. As for whether I ever confronted Marco or filed some kind of formal complaint, in all honesty, after discovering what truly appeared to be a professional-grade, illegally installed hidden surveillance architecture, I wanted to make a clean break and put that entire skin-crawling experience behind me as quickly as possible while still feeling relatively safe to travel back home. But I'll never again look at an Airbnb or rental property listing quite the same way without an overt, nagging sense of violated privacy constantly gnawing away at me. You know that feeling when something seems just a little too good to be true? That nagging intuition trying to poke holes and you're eagerly convincing yourself this is finally the big score. Yeah, I really should have listened to mine a bit closer before impulsively committing to this particular Airbnb booking. From the listing alone, this rustic A-frame cabin, tucked away in the densely forested Appalachian wilds, seemed to check every box for the perfect impromptu couple's retreat, billing itself as a romantic off-grid hideaway with unparalleled privacy at an unbelievably low nightly rate. Just by judging the semi-pro photo gallery, you'd never suspect this place carried any skeletons lingering in its closets. Even the owner's glowing reviews regaled about recently renovating the entire interior with newly refinished hardwood floors, countertops, you name it. Sold as an expertly modernized outdoorsman's paradise freshly exorcised of its prior homesteading roots. A true escape from our hyper-connected world where you could simply exist for a while, distraction-free in nature's lush embrace. In hindsight, though, the very first faint inkling that something might be asked you probably arrived before we even made the 4-hour cross-state road trip out to the middle of those desolate woods. Multiple times during the lead-up to our reservation, the host curiously insisted we furnish quite a few very specific groceries for ourselves in advance, rattling off a weirdly long shopping list of basic provisions they claimed wouldn't already be stocked on site. Chalking it up to the owner's extra thoroughness considering how remote the locale was advertised, I obliged with making all the prescribed bulk Costco runs for things like bottled water, fry snacks, over-the-counter meds, the whole nine. Little did I realize those premature breadcrumb trails were essentially the host leaving behind clues to prepare us for becoming temporarily institutionalized. So by the time we finally arrived at our advertised lover's den nestled amongst those misty backwoods hollers, all the dreamy escape vibes had already been solidly set in motion. All that remained was following through the cabin's ornately carved oak front door and allowing ourselves to be fully swept up into the listing's promised off-the-grid sanctuary ambience. Except from basically that first beholding footstep spreading across the place's brand new interior finishings. Something simply felt dissonantly amiss that I could never quite put my finger on all weekend. Despite the seamless contemporary makeover draped across virtually every square inch, faint iotas of inexplicably stale, musty odors still seemed to linger in the heaviest pockets of the place's airflow. More than just the usual earthy homestead fragrances you'd expect deep in the secluded forest, these were subtle whiffs carrying mysterious chemical undercurrents that made the little hairs on my arms instinctively stand on end. Like the unmistakable essence of some heavily industrialized operation had once taken root and unavoidably soaked into the cabin's very marrow despite its cheery new facades. Over the next few days spent valiantly striving to sink into that idealized solitary retreat ambience as advertised, each attempt only proved more futile than the last. Behind every little rearranged furniture vignette seemingly staged for maximum rustic high serenity now stood some slightly askew architectural element screaming its mutated truth about the space's sordid former purpose. Entire wings with floor plans that flowed counterintuitively for your standard ski chalet's traffic patterns, trailed by winding corridors leading down into suspicious second basement levels I sensed we weren't technically supposed to be accessing at all. Giant banks of apparently retrofitted UV lamps still mounted across once blacked-out windows on the upper level, emitting that telltale ultraviolet glow usually reserved for decontamination chambers. I'll never shake walking back from a mountainside hike to find my girlfriend utterly frozen, silently staring at some weird hieroglyphs hastily spray-painted over beneath the upstairs floorboards she accidentally disturbed. Crude symbols or sigils in what looked to be fresh scarlet paints. Hopefully just house paints, but still deeply unsettling all the same. And of course the obligatory eerie culmination, discovering an entire chamber in the deepest basement foundation bearing clear vestiges of an elaborately modified space. Filter vents lining the exterior entrance, hazmat gear littered across the side tables, plywood shipping crate debris everywhere bearing illegible stencil logos and chemical warnings now thoroughly sanded off. It honestly felt like we'd walked right into the climactic reveal of some found footage horror's cliffhanger ending. In the breathless seconds after stumbling across that ostensibly remediated lab space, my girlfriend and I experienced simultaneous explosive decompression of any pastoral serenity we'd been clinging onto all weekend. Dread-fueled sprints to hastily pack our belongings on autopilot, leaving that cursed cabin in our rearview mirror while expending more adrenaline than an Olympic track star on their way to anywhere but the scene of whatever fresh crime we were now accomplices to. For the remainder of the endless car ride straight through the night, neither of us uttered so much as a single word, only traded occasional shell-shocked glances in the rearview, while processing whatever traces might have just been left in our psychic wake from consorting with those unclean hillside energies. I'll spare you the scattered details that emerged in the following days' obsessive online research spirals, but let's just say the previous owners' identities seemed to bore all the hallmarks of some regional Big Lebowski anarcho-cult gone full darknet pharmacological terror out before their quaint side hustle landed them in indefinite federal accessory processing. These days, any passing utterance of the word detox, whether overheard at a conversational distance or on TV, instantly transports me back to those cold sweat flashbulbs of stumbling numbly through each freshly repurposed room's malignant intentionalities, wondering if permanent spores of whatever ancient pestilence took root there might have latched onto my astral body for a ride back to civilization already. And while I may have narrowly dodged becoming yet another forgotten statistic alongside, who knows how many fellow wayward glampers got their cord fully pulled mid-retreat, part of me fears whatever vengeful frequencies we briefly tuned into during that nightmarish layover may just be waiting patiently to cross over whenever I once again let my guard waterfalls down completely. I should pay closer attention to the fine print bearing that not-so-subtle disclaimer. Rustic mountain chalet accessible only by unpaved forest roads. Before booking this allegedly picturesque Airbnb nestled deep in the Rockies as our romantic weekend getaway. In my defense, the listing photos made the place seem like an idyllic snow globe fantasy, A cozy little log cabin retreat practically oozing Hidakosagans from its stone fireplaces and oversized bucolic window panes. Unknowing city dwellers that we were, how could we possibly predict the remoteness gauge being cranked up to literal isolation once that first winter storm blew in? Our initial drive up the winding gravel pathway seemed harrowing enough, fishtailing through snaking blind curves at a glacial pace while the flurries steadily intensified around us. By the time we finally cleared that last treacherous ridge hitting the chalet's front door, the unplowed mile-high altitude pastures surrounding us had become full-on winter wonderland whiteout conditions. Luckily, the owner Randy had been refreshingly communicative via text to help coach us through that final home stretch without veering off one of those perilous, cliff-streaked ravines. That first cozy night, smuggled up by the cracking fireplace while watching the blizzard blow sideways outside, I won't pretend we didn't revel in the novelty of surrendering ourselves to nature's awesome, uncompromising powerscapes. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no external stimuli whatsoever besides the howling winds battering the log exterior. For once, a genuine detox from societal toxins and reprogramming circuits to better sync with our pioneer ancestral fortitudes. But after one too many hours staring slack-jawed at those flickering embers, that postcard fantasy filter gradually started shedding off in eerie increments like a cinematic vignette burn. Maybe it was that third or fourth bourbon wearing off, but slowly the shadows began playing tricks on my peripherals in ways that felt unsettling. Fleeting abstract movements pulsing across my vision's borders, suggesting some form of adjacent life force hovering just past the warm living room threshold we cloistered ourselves inside. No matter how tightly I cinched shut my eyelids for momentary reprieves, upon reopening them that same unmistakable negative energy resonance persisted, seeping through the chalet's structural joins as an invasive frequency, rapidly establishing new ambient vibrations all its own. One by one, those signature cozy cabin aesthetics started subverting into signifiers of something ancient and primordially malicious. Suddenly, the hard edges and no-folds carved across every wood plank surface took on vaguely sinister iconographies, standing sentinel over our rattled sigils under siege. I tried shrugging off those initial radiation sickness symptoms. The full-body shivers, subtle vertigo waves, shallow reverberated heartbeats, echoing as if channeling through aquatic currents, as simply circumstantial hazards of potentially lethal altitudes compounded by our temporary entrapment in frigid conditions. But with every hour that crept deeper into the dead of night, new rogue emissions from spectral domains beyond the veil steadily massing oozed forth with increasingly menacing intentionality. At first, the paranormal disruptions were subtle enough to expound away as auditory pareidolias, wind chimes improvising ominous symphonies, faint footfall impressions pacing the floorboards overhead, those ambiguous rumblings heralding a rogue grizzly's surprise siege probe, or the groans of hundred-year-old beings giving up their own ghosts under thermal expansion duress. But as the icicles outside achieved maximum girth, defying all gravity and reason in their elongated occult geometry alignments, so too did the in-home intensity of our uninvited guest crescendo from dog whistles into profane poltergeist frequencies. The witching hour's arrival triggering dislocated howls and guttural moans echoing through the seasoned oak bureau drawers, shadows morphing into maligned augurish interlocutors climbing the walls all around us in ritualistic procession. The ungodly concussions making it feel like entire support beam balusters were sprawling out lazy Susans of salacious taunts, beckoning us deeper into those metaphysical crawl spaces no human was ever meant to wander. At its most overwhelming apogee, the entire chaletid practically ascended to some Cronenbergian plane of biomechanical hybridity, the whole structural homestead seemingly inhaling and exhaling ancient demonic seeds, as if possessed by some eldritch hive-mind infestation finally unleashing its apocalyptic swarm protocols. Eventually, the mental and physical exhaustions caught up to both of us at some indeterminate hour while lying petrified on the floor amid cacophonous geometric abattoir rituals pulsing all around. Upon finally rousing in what seemed like the first calm respite from the high strangeness vigil, we found ourselves startled near-side suffocates under dense velveteen blankets. The fireplace pilot light snuffed out, every gaseous wisp and ectoplasmic tendril frozen mid-apparent culmination by the previous evening's cataclysmic hypothermia backlash. Only once we'd emerged outside to find the entire idyllic snow-capped majesty supernaturally melted away, absorbed into charcoal desiccants, leaving the chalet's skeletal bones visible beneath, did we truly comprehend the enormity of whatever interdimensional biohazard outbreak had nearly consumed us both that endless nibble span. Randy frantically answering our distress signal simply to discover his quaint mountain hideaway transmutated into something out of the Ars Necronomica's unholy apocrypha as our sole answer. These days, any handed-off snifter of smoky firewood oak scotches instantly reactivates my PTSD receptors into volatile alerts, florid deliriant flashes of Brobdingnagian poltergeist detritus, cascading endless breaches through every orifice and vector plane all over again in full immersive panorama. A raw mania seizes my synapses, demanding I do whatever it takes to diffuse those cursed essences besieging my nomadic spirit once more, even if only in my mind's terrifying reconstructions. Because if I've carried even a fraction of those parasitic contagions back home incubating on some deeper resonance frequency, well, let's just say it may already be too late for any confinement firewalls or scorching decontamination protocols to safely quarantine the remnant ichor spread this late in the invasion cycle. Thank you all for listening in. If you haven't already, then please like and subscribe and help this new channel grow. It's free and means a lot.